This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Pete Browning had a wonderful baseball career, one in which he hit .341, won 3 batting titles, once hit over .400, and was the first baseball player to use a bat crafted by the owners of the company that later created the Louisville Slugger. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to discuss the remarkable career of one of the game's great pioneers, Pete Browning.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 152, Pete Browning. Now, what makes this such a unique show today is that Pete Browning was a career .341 hitter, played in 3 leagues, the American Association, the Players League, and the National League, and during his time, he just might have been the game's best hitter. He named all of his bats, believed a bat only had so many hits in it, and he had quirks. Man, did he have quirks. And joining me on today's show is Tim Newby, who wrote a terrific book about Pete Browning called The Original Louisville Slugger. In fact, Tim's book is so good, it was named a finalist for the Casey Award. Before we get into today's show, a little bit of housekeeping. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook, and wherever it is you are listening, please follow, rate, and review. And hey, if you have a question or comment, please hit me up at sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. As always, thanks for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, Tim Newby. Tim, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk some baseball and talk some Pete and some 19th century baseball tonight.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, that's for sure. And I'm actually going to start today's show for the first time ever with a trivia question.
Oh, man, it's a lot of pressure.
I'm quite sure you know the answer, but it's a pretty cool question. So, Tim, can you name the only player in the history of baseball that includes over 20,000 players who have appeared in a Major League Baseball game to have won a batting title as a rookie, at least 3 batting titles overall, a batting title in 2 leagues, and to have hit over 400 in one single season?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for most people, they'd want to answer it with, some big names, Babe Ruth or Willie Mays or Lou Gehrig or something like that, but it's not. It's Pete Browning, who is the only person who can say he's done all of that.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about that is He won, like we said, as a rookie, hitting .378 in the American Association. He again won, that was in 1882. In 1885, he won again, hitting .362. And then in 1890, in the Players League, he hit .373. The year he hit over 400, .402, he didn't win the batting title.
Yeah, he finished second that year. And the year before even that, in 1886, he basically loses a batting title by what would come out to about a hit to a teammate who was a pitcher, actually, the guy Hecker. So, I mean, he had a run there where, I mean, he could have conceivably had 5 titles between 1882 and 1890. And then to throw one more in there, in 1891, he was third in the NL in batting and broke his wrist at the end of the year and was on a tear at the end. And, you know, can we imagine if he had 3 titles in four titles in 3 different leagues? I mean, that's something that would never happen again. So, yeah,
sure.
he was pretty good.
What was baseball like back then, the days of Pete Browning? There were a few leagues. Of course, the American League was still very far off. But what were the leagues and what were the teams back then?
So you had the National League. Pete played most of his career in the American Association, not to be confused with the American League, which I think is sometimes the confusion with that, but it wasn't. And there was other leagues that would pop up at the time. There was a Union Association that was there for about 2 seasons. There was the Players League, which was in 1890, which is a really interesting league. It's when the players are trying to take ownership, and usually we think about players striking or having some kind of problem with their salary. And here they wanted to take ownership. They thought they should have some ownership in teams, and they should have some investment in that. So it's a year when all the best players kind of were in this one league. I think interesting for Pete for the era is the American Association is always kind of looked at as kind of the little brother or the lesser league of the National League. I don't think that's always entirely accurate, but because the National League is sort of the victor out of this and they're the one that lasts, I think that's the perception we have. But I don't think that's always exactly true. Players move back and forth between the leagues pretty regularly, and their statistics would be about the same. There wasn't a lot of difference if they finished 3rd or 4th in batting in one league. They could probably expect to do about the same in the other one. But it's a really interesting era in baseball. It's, to me, when baseball is kind of becoming baseball. I kind of like this story of the 19th century because we all have an idea of what baseball looks like and what a field looks like and how it's played. But at this time, it was different. I mean, we still don't have a mound for much of this era, right? They're pitching from a pitching box. They can't release the ball above their shoulder for much of the time. They're not having like, a roster or a rotation of pitchers is coming through. One guy's out there and he's pitching 70 games on the year. It's different. They were even things that are so ingrained kind of for baseball, strikes and balls were changing. They were every year that was kind of going up and down. We're going to have, 5 balls for a while. We're going to have 4, so even that was kind of being adjusted. So I think it's a really interesting era to dive into. And I think because we can't watch any of those games, it's a little harder. We have to use our imagination a little bit. And for me, like as I was kind of doing this book, that was one of the things I enjoyed the most was this idea of like, what was baseball? We all know what it looks like now, but back then it was just really different. And it was neat to see the differences there. I also think it's interesting that you look at something like batting and, if a player is hitting 300 now, he's pretty good. If he's hitting 400, he's done something special. And in the 1800s, it was kind of the same thing. It's amazing with all these changes. You're still amazing if you do it 4 out of 10 times. You're still really good if you do it 3 out of 10 times. And you're everybody else if you do it at 2 out of 10, despite all the changes we've had and everything. So it's neat to see that as much as, things change, the more it can stay the same sort of.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the pitching. You couldn't pitch above your shoulder. I've done a couple of podcasts about some guys from back in the day, Jim McCormick being one of them, and he would throw 70 games in a season. It was crazy back then, but certainly a different game. So let me ask you this. Who was Pete Browning, and why don't we know more about him?
That's a really good question. I think so. Pete was born in 1861 in Louisville. So he kind of comes of age as baseball's kind of coming of age. He is a really athletic person. He's an athletic kind of youth, but he also develops a really severe health issue, which is going to impact a lot of who he's going to become. It was mastoiditis, and at the time, it was a pretty severe health issue. It could be life-threatening for children. It's basically an infection of your inner ear. Nowadays, it's treatable with antibiotics. So those weren't available in Pete's time. For him, it's going to basically rob him mostly of his hearing. He was probably mostly deaf by the time he was a teenager. He still could hear on some level, but it's going to give him severe headaches, vertigo, cause pain and swelling in his eyes, swelling behind his ears, and a lot of his other personality quirks are going to kind of be impacted by this. He was known to be a very loud, boisterous, kind of cocky person, but I think some of that can kind of relate back to this health issue here. He has a little bit of a limited education. Again, for the era, that was probably, they're not exactly everybody's going to college. But for somebody who couldn't hear that well, that was probably a bit of a struggle, so that kind of impacted him. He was one of the best players of his era, but he's kind of forgotten. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as I was saying, a few minutes ago, the National League sort of becomes the league that lasts. The American Association folds by the end of the 19th century and kind of is forgotten about. And so I think a lot of those players from that league kind of get forgotten. Pete is kind of remembered. There's some legendary and myth kind of stories about him, and I think that's more what he is remembered for, connection with Louisville Slugger, things like that. But I think the reason he's forgotten is simply because of that he has these couple of things we remember him for, but because he was in the other league, it's easy to overlook it. And the further and further we get away from 19th century baseball, the less we kind of connect to that. And I think it's really interesting and important to still remember those players. And there's other players of that era who have been overlooked a little bit, but it's important to remember that history. But it's just, there's nobody who directly connects to that. There's no game footage to watch. There's no sports writer who was around and goes, oh, let me tell you about this guy here. I mean, we have to read stuff and read accounts and newspapers and stuff. So I think that's a little bit why he's kind of been overlooked throughout the years.
You talked about, I hope I say it right, mastoiditis. He had a difficult childhood on top of the mastoiditis, right? Didn't his father pass away, died in a tornado or something like that when he was 13 years old? The mastoiditis basically left him deaf. Like you said, it's something that's not even a big deal today, but it was a big deal back then. And because of that, he didn't go to school and he was illiterate. Talk about how that really shaped the kind of person he became. All of this, no father, illiteracy, basically being deaf.
Yeah, interestingly enough, his father died when he was 13. The family still seemed to kind of maintain their wealth. His father was a merchant, and Pete, despite whatever struggles would come with the lack of a father there, he had a lot of older brothers. So he still seems to have a fairly good childhood there. He lives with his mom his whole entire life. And I think there's a number of reasons we can kind of go with there. I think deep down inside, he was a shy, insecure person. But the mastoiditis itself, I think, really is what is going to impact who he is. Like we said, it kind of impacted his hearing greatly. I think the most obvious area to impact him is his name is not Pete. His name is Louis Rogers Browning. But he took to calling everybody he met Pete because he likely couldn't hear an introduction, and he would just start calling everybody Old Pete, and the nickname eventually got stuck on him. Some of his personality quirks, his loud, boisterous natures, I think can be traced to the fact that he couldn't hear. I mean, if I'm in a conversation with you and I can't hear what you're saying that well, the easiest thing to do is turn the conversation back on the one thing I know the best, and that's me. And I can talk about how good I am at baseball and how great I am and what I'm going to do later. And so it comes off that way. It also kind of, I think, led into some of his other habits. He has a really, really severe drinking problem. In an era of hard drinking baseball players, Pete was a champion consumer of bourbon by no means. And with Pete, lots of the stories about him always tie back to baseball, and everything's about baseball. For Pete, baseball was all consuming. And the stories of how he started drinking both kind of relate to baseball. One of them was he was a teenager, and he was pitching at the time, and he was dominating a game with a bunch of older men. And so in between innings, they started feeding him beer in hopes that it would kind of like ruin his game a little bit. The other one is that he was playing a game and they had a keg of beer at third base. And every time you got to third base, you were entitled to a glass of beer. So Pete went out there and made sure he got a lot of hits so he could land on third. However, he discovered alcohol. He sort of soon found that it solved a lot of problems for him. He had pain in his head. and that helps solve them. That helps solve some of his maybe like his social issues from not being able to hear. And, so I think for Pete, he really discovered that, the whiskey definitely eased the pain for him on some level there. And then he had a lot of odd personality quirks that would come with a man of limited education there.
Yeah, we're going to get into some of that, some of his quirks, some of his habits, just some weird stuff. And, we're going to get into some of this stuff. But before we do, how did he find baseball?
So in his neighborhood, there was a local semi-pro team, and there was a group of brothers, the Rexius brothers, who the oldest brother kind of ran the team. And baseball was pretty popular in Louisville at the time. They had the first team in the city started about 1859, so right before Pete was born. And so they had a number of teams that played, kind of locally and stuff like that. Pete got hooked up with a group of friends in his neighborhood. They were in the west end of Louisville. And a number of those guys actually wanted to play Major League Baseball as well. There's Chicken Wolf and Fred Pfeffer. John McLaughlin was with them. So they had a lot of guys who had gone to play and had different levels of success, some of the Rexius brothers. And they just kind of started as kind of, teenagers playing. They eventually started playing for this team in the West End called the Eclipse. They soon quickly kind of become the elite kind of local team and kind of dominate within the city. And from there, they kind of transition to like a semi-pro team, playing some of those other big semi-pro teams around the country, like Akron and teams like that. And so they were really this kind of powerhouse semi-pro team. Louisville loses their National League team in 1877. So for a few years, they have no major league team, and all eyes in the city were kind of on this team here. In 1882, they were going to get a team in the American Association, and basically they just took this Eclipse club, and with the addition of a couple of other players, that group of guys becomes this major league team there. And so Pete kind of transitions in from there, and he was always, one of the younger guys on the team. I mean, his rookie year, he was 18 years old.
So he finds his way onto this team, the Louisville Eclipse. I think at one point they might have been the Colonials too, or the Colonels or something like that. But the one really interesting thing about Pete and his baseball career was, the way I read it, he really didn't care about anything on the baseball field with the exception of one thing, and that was hitting. Defense be damned. He didn't really care much about defense. He sort of, I don't know if you would say he didn't care whether or not his team won, but he didn't really care about what the final score was. All he only cared about was his hitting, how many hits he got in a game, and how well he did. How did that rub his teammates?
He actually was pretty well liked. It doesn't ever really seem that it really bothered teammates. They would make comments to him, but I think, and I talk about this in the book some, I think it becomes a little overblown, and that's part of the myth of Pete, is that how much he didn't care about defense. A lot of it becomes self-inflicted. Early on in his career, he was playing second base and shortstop. You don't put your best defensive players, your worst defensive players at those positions, no matter what era it is. But the problem was with his hearing, he was having trouble kind of hearing oncoming runners approaching the base path. So he took to standing with one leg up kind of like this to protect himself. And, again, I am not some high-level baseball coach, but I know that is not the best position to be in to play defense. He kept moving further and further out of the base path, which, again, isn't the best way to, attack ground balls, but he was trying to avoid being run over by other runners. So eventually they move him to the outfield, and he continues to do some of the same things. He stands on one leg because, again, he can't hear teammates who are calling him off of a fly ball or expecting him to call it off. And so he just stops moving. But this is, to me, is kind of the thing about Pete, is Pete could never just admit there was an issue or problem there. So Pete's defense was, look, I can go out here and run her down and catch these balls over there, but then I'm going to be tired and can't hit the plate. Let's go let the young fellows over there go catch the ball, and I'm going to save myself to hit at the plate. And instead of just admitting that he had a problem and, I can't hear, or here's what the issue is, he would kind of pass it off that kind of way, like, well, look, this is why I'm not doing it. Because there's a lot of reporting, even when he was moving to the outfield, that he was extremely athletic. There's reporting from one game. The reporter talks about how he leapt 6 feet into the air to catch the ball, and it's so unfair that Pete is this athletic that he can do this kind of stuff. So he still had those moments, but it just, as some of his health issues kind of overtake, he stopped moving. The heat started really impacting his head. In certain games, they had trees kind of lining the field, and he took to standing in the shade despite what it may mean defensively. So I think he kind of gave up. He even starts taking to stopping ground balls with his feet, which sounds like this man who's just given up on defense. But if you think about it, if you have vertigo, if you bend over to pick up a ball, it's likely to cause you dizziness and you might fall over. So I think for Pete, this idea of defense, like, he gave up on it, but he gave up on it for a reason. And then instead of just admitting and trying to say, look, hey, here's why the problem is, he being Pete, because he couldn't admit that, says, look, I can go out there and play defense, but then I'm not going to be good at the plate, and I'm way more important at the plate. So how about I save myself and you find somebody else to shag a fly ball for you?
So his deafness really did affect his defense. How about communicating with his teammates? How did his deafness affect his ability to communicate?
It doesn't appear he was completely deaf, unlike some other players. So it just seems that, he's generally was hard of hearing. He spoke loud, maybe wouldn't hear things that were said to him. But he still could communicate. It doesn't seem to be that there was any problem there. I mean, he was still a very social guy. He was known to go out, after games and, was an extremely popular player at the bar and would tell stories and expound on his greatness and stuff like that. So that part doesn't seem to be just the personal kind of communicating doesn't seem a problem. There's no reporting that he had to take to any other means to communicate or anything like that. So, it seems while he was hard of hearing and deaf, it wasn't total deafness. He could hear on some level, but he definitely struggled with that.
Tim, I recently wrote a book. It took me a while to come up with the topic, to research the topic, to figure out, is this what I want to write it on? Now, of course, once you do one, you want to do more, and I have other topics. How did you discover Pete Browning? What inspired you to write a biography about him? And I mean, he is certainly an overlooked and unknown, a forgotten hero of the game. Tell me about that journey for you. How did you discover him and then go about writing about it?
So I just finished my second book, which is Leftover Salmon 30 Years of Festival, which is about a progressive bluegrass band. And, most people are like, well, how do you make this connection from there to Pete Browning? My first book is about the history of bluegrass in Baltimore. Well, we were in Louisville, my wife and I, and we were touring the factory, the Slugger Museum. And I was vaguely aware of Pete.
Which, by the way, is a really cool museum. I went out there. How about that bat out front?
It's very cool. Great. And if you're in Louisville, you also got the Muhammad Ali Museum. The Muhammad Ali Museum is unbelievable as well. They're both. I mean, it's a great city. It's a great town. But so we're there, and I was vaguely aware of Pete, knew a little bit of the history, knew the name, but beyond that, I couldn't say I knew much. And on the tour, they kind of tell some stories of Pete, and I was kind of had my antenna out looking for another story, another possible idea. And my wife was like, wow, this guy's pretty interesting. So I remember that night at dinner, we're sitting there, and we're just, eating dinner and, drinking a beer and looking stuff up on our phone, like, oh, this is interesting. And I thought, I'm really curious why there doesn't seem to be more about this guy. So I said, well, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and start researching and see if there's a reason. Maybe his story is only this big and that's it. Maybe there's nothing else there. Well, as I started researching it, his story really spoke to what I like to write about. And this is how it connects to this progressive bluegrass band or bluegrass in Baltimore, is I tend to like to write about these kind of overlooked, underappreciated musicians, bands, athletes, whatever it may be, but yet who are still hugely influential in what they do. And Pete really fit into that. Here's this guy who's, on paper, his numbers, his stats, kind of jump out and you go, whoa, why do I know more about him? He has all these other things. And that to me is like, well, then why don't we know about him? And that's what I wanted to discover. And then you start getting into his story and you're like, well, this guy's got all these weird, interesting things and what's going on. And then it's like, well, now I want to understand where the myth is versus the truth. So, we were on that. It all comes from being on that tour and just always liking these kind of underappreciated or overlooked stories because I feel to me, that is interesting no matter whether you're into music or whether you're into sports or football or baseball. Just the story of that person and what they do is always very intriguing and interesting.
You talk about the going to Louisville, and really that's where you discover Pete and where your interest in Pete began. There is such a connection between Louisville, he grew up there, and Louisville Slugger, Hillerich and Bradsby Company. And it leads, his association with H&B leads to the creation of the first ever custom-made bat. Talk about that and how that he and H&B became associated, and it was sort of like, it was almost sneaky that this bat was made for him. And it was basically, if I understand correctly, the bat was made, he met someone, and this person was a fan, and this was the reason they made this custom bat for Pete was it was the first time ever he had gone 2 straight games without a hit. Heaven to Betsy.
Yeah. So the myth is that first of all, the myth of it, in 1884, Pete was in the midst of a slump and he broke his favorite bat. Pete was really into his bats. He believed that, like, bats could be used, bigger bats, smaller bats. And at the time, bats were kind of an afterthought. If a bat broke, they may nail it back together. But Pete really put thought into it, so he cared for it. Like, he thought, like, if I break my bat, I've got to get one to replace it. Now, on another thing, too, partly why Pete cares about his bats so much is he kind of has an interesting personality quirk with him. So he believes all bats have a predetermined number of hits, which is really kind of great because if you don't get a hit, it's not your fault. Your bats run out of hits and you just need to get another bat. It's a really kind of almost like involuntary way to like take the pressure off yourself. But anyway, so in 1884, Pete breaks his bat. The myth is he was approached by Bud Hillerich, who was the son of J.F. Hillerich, who owned Hillerich Woodworking Company. They weren't Hillerich and Bradsby at the time. They did not make bats. They were making other things you could do with lathes, chair legs and stair rails and butter churns and things like that. Bud approaches Pete and says, I could make you another bat. J.F., Bud's father, was against baseball at the time because of the gambling and the drinking that was associated with it. So under the cover of night, Pete and Bud go into the shop, and Bud, under the direction of Pete, turns this bat, and Pete goes out the next day and goes 4 for 4, and the legend is born. Now, that's the legend of it. What really happened? Well, that's always the good question there. There's a lot of debate because there was no written down direct evidence at the time of Pete going to the factory and having it made. Though to me, that's a little bit of proof that it did happen, because I don't know why a 17-year-old who's going against his dad wishes would write that down, and Pete was just getting another bat made. What more than likely happened was Pete probably already knew Bud on some level. Bud played local baseball, played baseball in the area, and probably had made some bats for himself. So Pete probably knew that Bud had made bats or had the ability to make bats. So there was probably a connection there. Bud made him a bat. Pete really liked it. The more important thing is this: regardless of what Pete does the next day with the bat, Pete continues to get bats from there. And there was a lot of kind of stories and anecdotes throughout the rest of Pete's career of him getting bats from a firm in Louisville. Now, full disclosure, it never says what firm it is that he gets them from. But I like to think we can make that leap of faith and say, when we're talking about the firm Louisville that makes bat, and then they put his nickname on a bat, in 1895, that we can make the connection they were the ones always doing it. So throughout the rest of the 1880s, this firm is turning bats for Pete. And again, just on kind of a small level, they are still not a bat company. Pete also would get them made for other teammates and start passing them out. So I think it's fair to say he helps kind of spread the word of what they can do. They do eventually start producing bats in the 1890s and quickly become a large producer of bats. The nickname that they put on their bats, the Louisville Slugger, was a nickname that was applied to Pete in the 1890s. It's one of his lesser used names, ironically, but I think it's a little harder to have the Prince of Bourbon on a bat than it is the Louisville Slugger. The Louisville Slugger fits a whole lot better. So they start putting those on.
Could have put Gladiator on there.
Yeah. And to digress on the Gladiator, it's interesting. The Gladiator is kind of his most famous name, and that doesn't even come in until like the 1887 season. So it's even later in his career, which is kind of funny that that's the name that really associates with him. But so anyway, the company eventually evolves and starts producing bats, and they will partner up with Bradsby and become Hillick and Bradsby. And there's definitely kind of reporting all throughout kind of the early part of the 20th century about Pete's connection there. And there's still debate about it, and other players have laid claim to it, or there'll be some research on the say he didn't have it done. I believe he had the bat turn there. I think the fair argument can be made. It was the first custom-made bat, made to a professional player's specifications. They continued to make bats for him. They eventually, morphed or transitioned to a bat company. And then even another interesting story is the first player who's going to have their kind of name on a bat that they sell is Honus Wagner. Pete knew Honus Wagner. Honus Wagner starts his career in Louisville. Pete had retired at that point, or I don't like to say retired, I like to say he wasn't playing anymore because he would have gladly went out and played some more. But Pete kept all of his bats when he was done with them, and he had them in his basement. And each bat had a tag on it of what he may have done with it. 3 hits here in St. Louis, or 2 hits here, some amazing thing. Honus Wagner came over and picked up one of the bats and really liked it. Pete said, "You can take that bat with you." So I don't think it's out of the stretch of imagination to also believe that Honus may have kind of come to understand the power of the Hiller Company bats, what would be Louisville Slugger, through Pete as well.
You said that he believed that a bat only had so many hits in it. How did he go about? He had names for these bats. Biblical characters talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, he really cared for his bats. When he traveled on the road, he would take them all with him, whereas some players would kind of just use whatever bat was in the pile. Pete put some thought into it. He would use longer bats or heavier bats based on the pitchers. He named all of them. And again, because he kind of believed they had a predetermined number of hits, to me, it makes it really easy. When you feel like you enter a slump, you just need a new bat. You don't have to do anything else. You're not doing anything wrong. And to me, that's not a bad way to approach hitting, right? Like, it's not my fault. I'm doing the right thing. Instead of overanalyzing my swing, just put this one aside and let's go back out here and try again. Because again, if I do it 3 out of 10 times, I'm pretty good, So to me, I think it's an interesting thing with that. He really did, though, care about all these bats a lot. He was known on the road. He had to pay extra baggage fees to bring a bag full of bats with him. And he was not against finding other bats he appreciated. He always kind of proudly says he never stole a bat. He always traded for him. So at games, if he saw a bat on the opposing bench that he liked, he would approach them and try and trade for that bat or, obtain that bat some way. But he always said, "I never stole a bat."
What were some of the names that he put on the bats?
That's interesting. It's always just a very general biblical names, but there's not like, he has, Old Black or Moses or Noah or anything like that is kind of known. It seems a very general idea that he kind of just named those bats. And he was known to kind of talk to his bats as he approached up to the plate. So I'm sure people overheard him as he's speaking to these bats, walking up there and whispering things to them and, what they need to do for him.
Now, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but before he went to H&B, how did baseball players get their bats? Who was making the bats? How was all that done?
I mean, I think wherever they could find it from. There wasn't as much thought in it. And, I'm sure that there are people who are getting bats made and turned, obviously, on some level, because there are bats existing. But they were kind of getting them from anywhere and shaping them however they could. There just wasn't the care for them. There's a story of bats breaking and people just nailing them back together so they continue working.
Yeah, that was the next question. Like, what was the shape? Was the shape similar to a baseball bat of today? I mean, what were the regulations around the bats? I mean, I don't know if you know much about that.
Yeah, I can't speak to that. I mean, Pete's bat was a monster club. It was
long, 48 ounces or something like that.
Yeah, somebody told me a really great way to help understand how heavy that bat is, right? Because I think 48 ounces, we may not have a good idea. Somebody told me that Aaron Judge swings a 33-ounce bat, right? His donut that he puts on to warm up is 15 ounces. So when he stands in the on-deck circle swinging that bat, it's a 48-ounce bat. That's what Pete swing every single time.
Wow.
So I thought that's a good way to understand. And the handle didn't taper as much. It was really big. Pete was known to have big hands. So again, it takes big hands to hold this bat there.
Yeah, I wonder how many Wonder Boys there were, right?
Yeah.
Natural, Robert Redford, Roy
Yeah.
Hobbs. Yeah. You know, we touched on this. He was so quirky, eccentric. He had these crazy behaviors, such as refusing to slide, standing on one leg during the games. How did these quirks affect his performance and his public perception? I mean, drinking Worcestershire, I can never say that word, Worcestershire sauce and Tabasco sauce, washing his eyes with buttermilk to help improve his ability to hit a baseball. Where does some of this come from?
So I think that's it. So that's part of the myth and legend we know of Pete is these weird quirks he had. And we kind of talked about in the field, he stood on one leg. And I think when you just hear him standing on one leg, you're like, what is this crazy guy doing? But when we understand that he couldn't hear and there's a reason for it. And so he had all these other quirks that he would do off the field to help him improve his playing. He was known, I mean, the care for his eyes, or what he called his lamps, was just excessive. He was known to wash them with buttermilk. You know, he was known to like drink weird concoctions of things. You know, if it rained, he would kind of look up to the sky to hope that it would wash them out. He would smoke cigarettes and like blow the smoke out in hopes that it would get in his eyes. When he rode on trains, you know, he would always say, I'm trying to hang my head out the window in hopes that ash or soot will get in my eyes. Now,
why?
Well, so, and I think that, you know, if we just hear that, it's easy to go, it's crazy Pete. But as we said, he's a man of limited education in an era of questionable medical practices. He also has this medical condition that's kind of hard to understand. It's causing him lots of pain and swelling in his eyes. So I think a lot of these can be seen as him trying to self-medicate. You know, I think, you know, pouring buttermilk into your eyes on the surface can sound soothing. And I'm sure there was a soothing aspect to it. You know, I am sure that on some of these other things he's doing, he's believing I'm trying to like take care of my eyes. And the other side of it is this, if you think about it, he recognizes how important his eyes is, right? I mean, right now there's all, you know, eye training, right? How you look at things and tracking a ball. In 1880, Pete was recognizing that he's got to be able to see pretty well to hit. But so I think you can kind of trace his health issues again to a lot of these quirks. Now, you know, you can't explain all of exactly why they're doing it, but it all is tied back to him trying to cure or solve this issue with his eyes, right? The smoke is helping him feel better, or it's just, you know, taking the pain away on some level or whatever it's doing. Pouring buttermilk in his eyes, it's easing the pain. He believes that drinking mustard and Worcestershire sauce and Tabasco sauce, you know, with ginger in it is going to help them, you know. And again, you know, you can't necessarily explain how it made him feel, but I think deep down inside he was doing it to solve those issues there. And when you think of it that way, it can change the perception a little bit of what he is doing and why he's doing it, right? It's not just some crazy guy out there. He has some thought on some level behind it.
How good a hitter was he? What made him such a good hitter?
I mean, I think like anything, right? Like there has to be a level of, you know, just talent, right? But there's a lot of stories of Pete working hard, of him getting up in the morning and going out there. And he put a lot of time with that. I think he really cared about hitting. I think he thought about hitting in a way that other players weren't at the time. Now, what does that mean? You know, that's hard to quantify, but I think he approached hitting and thought about hitting. And again, he must have had some great eye-hand coordination, whether that was natural, whether it was just because he was an athletic person. That's hard to say, but he had a lot of natural talent there. He was known to being a really good athlete. He was kind of a really good ice skater. He was a champion marble player, which is interesting because like Pee Wee Reese from Louisville was also a champion marble player. He couldn't swim because of his ears, which is the one thing a lot of boys would do in the air at the time. But so he seems to be a really good athlete, and that all translates. But there, again, I think he also worked really hard, which is easy to overlook because of some of the other, you know, quirks. It's easy to talk about this, you know, loud, boisterous nature. But, you know, he did work. There's stories of him being on the road at games and getting up to the field early and just hitting by himself, throwing the ball up and hitting it and doing stuff like that. So I think it's a combination of all that. I mean, there's a level of natural talent or whatever it is. He was just, you know, an athletic person, and then he did work hard at it.
You know, he obviously playing in the time period when he played, like you said, we can't go back and look at film and see what kind of ball player he was and just how good he was and how good the talent was that he was facing. So it's really difficult to discuss particular games, but there are a couple. August 8th, 1886, he hit for a natural cycle against a team called the New York Metropolitans. Can you describe that achievement and its significance in baseball history?
Yeah, I kind of forget the numbers, but it was one of the earliest examples of a cycle being hit. He's going to hit for multiple cycles in his career. And I mean, and still, that is, a pretty hard achievement when you think about that. I mean, yes, there's other things that may be more impressive, but that's a pretty impressive achievement. So I think that there's a lot of those things with Pete like that speak to how good a hitter he really was and what he could do and how naturally kind of talented he was as a player. And I think a lot of the outside stuff can kind of color and make you like overlook that he was really good and could do lots of things and was a good fielder or could do that and stuff. So I think, hearing about these games, he hits for a cycle or the number of times he went 4 for 4 or things like that, especially when we're talking about doing this in an era when like fields were different, right? Like, he finished second one year with 9 home runs. So again, it's not in an era when like guys were blasting home runs. The fields are bigger. There's maybe non-existent fences out there. They're using one ball all game. By the end of the game, it's just this, this mush, this mess. Again, yeah, so I think that also speaks to it as well. And I think the thing to understand is it's hard to, and this is to kind of completely digress in different direction, where it's easy looking back to look at numbers of somebody and go, oh, well, how do they compare with this? Well, how do they compare to the players he played against? To me, that's the most important thing. What does what he did then compare against the other players? That's the only people we can really compare him against, right? We can't compare him to 30 years later because the game had evolved. And, he was considered one of the best players of that era. So I think we need to kind of recognize what people's eyes at the time told them.
Who are some of the other players in that era that we might know? Were there other players from that era that were ultimately elected into baseball's Hall of Fame?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's definitely players from that era. I think a lot of players from that era, you get like guys like Ed Galante who are kind of known for kind of crazy. He has a crazy kind of life and death, and I think there's more characters from that era.
I did a podcast on Ed Delahanty. Was one of the first ones I did. I mean, his whole death and him going to the Players League. I mean, it's a crazy story.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to look at some of these guys, and some of the ones that I sort of gravitated towards within there are the ones who maybe aren't as well known. One of Pete's teammates was this guy, Guy Hecker. He is the only pitcher to win a batting title and a pitching title. So when Shohei Ohtani does it, let's remember it's been done before. Guy Hecker one year went 52-20 and won a batting title. So, you're up, Shohei. You know what I mean? Like, let's see if you can go 52-20. So I kind of gravitated towards players like that. I think to me, there's so many interesting players at this era, and part of it too is just the nicknames of the era. Which again, like I know you weren't really quite asking about this, but I always really gravitate toward these great nicknames. Flying things, death to flying objects. These are guys' nicknames. Chicken Wolf. So I kind of always love those things. But there's just the stories of these players and these guys. It's so deep and so interesting, and there's so much there that I think that like it's great to kind of dig into 19th century baseball and move away from kind of our comfort zone and what we know as far as baseball.
A lot of stories, a lot of myths. One of the stories made me think that he must have had incredible control, uncanny control over the bat. And that dates to a game in 1888 when he fouled off 12 pitches in a row, right? And the owner of the team was like, all right, enough of this. Put the ball in play. And so, yeah, I'll just foul off another one.
And he fouled it off in his direction, right? He fouled it off right at him.
The control that he had over the bat, talk about that.
Well, and again, I think that speaks to what you were asking earlier about what made him so good. I think that kind of bat control doesn't come without practice. And again, he started very young, right? He started as a young teenager and was really good, really fast. He played in a game as a 15-year-old against the Major League Louisville Grays, and he was pitching and shut him out 4-0. So I think it speaks to how talented he was, but there's a lot of work there with that. I don't think that kind of bat control just happens by accident. And again, I think that speaks to stories of him going out there and hitting. And that's the side that he would never talk about because that's not funny. That's not interesting. That's who cares about hard working? The funnier story is when I talk about myself and I talk about I hit a ball around the world or something. That's better than me going out there in the morning and talking about how hard I worked.
Yeah, the myths, the legends, the stories. Tell us about the all around the world hit.
So I think there's a lot of talk about Pete's power, and this is an era when it's going to be different when we think about power, right? There's, again, home runs are much different. It was a different game, right? It was more about, getting on base and stuff. And Pete was known to hit the ball hard and far. Right? He always talked about how scared third baseman would be because he was going to rip one down at them. And, third basemen were scared that he was going to take their head off or he was going to, rip their shins apart and stuff like that. But writers would often kind of romanticize these hits he had. He was in Atlantic City and he hit one ball one time that went around the world. And again, I don't think that happened. I wasn't there. I can't speak to that. But I think we can all believe it didn't go around the world. But that means it must have went pretty hard. There was stories of him hitting the ball into the next county and the ball burying itself into some brick wall and stuff like that. So I think it more just speaks to how kind of impressive his power must have been if this is what people are saying about it, right? Obviously, we recognize that it's, been romanticized a little bit and it's a bit of a myth. But to talk about somebody that way, you don't do that if somebody's just kind of dribbling a ball down the line. He must have really been crushing them. He talks about how much he would make the Carpenters work because he was destroying the fence in center field because he just kept hitting it and stuff like that. So I think that it really speaks to how much power he did have. And he was a big guy for the era. And he's using a 48-ounce bat. So
young ball players always look up to the veterans. They watch them. They follow. What kind of influence did Pete have on his teammates? John Riley and smoking, rookies ordering some sort of weird food concoctions. Tell us about the influence that he had on his teammates.
So Pete often influenced them to do some of the odd, quirky behaviors that he did. I think players, like you mentioned, John Riley, looked at him and saw how well he was hitting and thought, well, you're smoking, I need to smoke there. But of course, when Riley started smoking, he didn't have the success. And Pete said, well, that's because you don't believe it's going to help you, whereas I do. He would kind of talk these rookies into drinking these weird concoctions and, whether he was doing it to mess with them or because he truly believed that's what you had to do. That kind of seems to be where there's a bit of the questionable line there. It does seem that his influence, though, he wasn't one to necessarily kind of take people under his wing and help them that way. He never really seemed to kind of have that kind of personality side to him. And again, probably can trace some of that to lack of education, a lack of confidence, which after all these stories, it's hard to believe, but he seems to kind of be a shy individual, or a shy.
Yeah, he was somewhat of an introvert.
Yeah, and so I think that it's hard to imagine him being somebody who was going to do those things, and it's easier again to just kind of have this silly, loud thing and have the rookies drink something, whether they know what they're doing or whether he believes it works or not.
How did the mastitis? It led to the alcoholism. How did that impact his career? How much better of a ball player could he have been? Is it even possible to fathom how much better he might have been? And how did it affect his personal life? I mean, back to the diamond, suspensions, his reputation, and then his personal life. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly his health issues impacted his play. I mean, it's hard to quantify how much better he would have been because he was already, quite a bit better than most players there. His drinking as well. I mean, he regularly played drunk, regularly played, hungover. And again, clearly that had an impact. But if he's still going out there after a night of drinking and going 3 for 4, it's hard to figure out exactly how much better he could have been with that. But it definitely impacted him. He has a stretch, 1888, 1889, that are just pretty miserable seasons. He's suspended quite a bit. The team's bad, and he's really struggling. He seems to get mostly sober around 1890. How sober he is, that's kind of up in debate because there's stories about him still drinking, but he seems to be mostly sober. His health issues really seem to start kind of overtaking some of his playing in the early 1890s. And it seems to cause a lot more problems with vertigo, and he really struggles with the heat, which would kind of exacerbate some of the conditions there. And he's out of baseball by 1894, so his career is a tad short, on the number scale that way. 1882 to 1894, and 1894, he just plays a handful of games with visiting teams. So that it impacts him that way. I mean, it's hard to really say how much better he would have been. Would he have had a longer career? Because again, remember, he started when he was 18, so it wasn't like he was an old man when he finally stopped playing. And I say stopped playing because he still was trying to get on teams and nobody really wanted him at that point. But I also think it impacts him because of the drinking. There was a perception around him about who Pete was. And despite it being an era of, lots of players drinking, there was a perception around Pete that was rightly deserved early on. He kind of changes that later on, but that kind of perception and image is always there. And I think some teams were hesitant to want to have to deal with that. And there's still the loud side of Pete that maybe you just don't want to deal with. So it definitely impacted his game, impacted his career greatly.
He played for Louisville for almost a dozen years in the American Association. Then he jumped to the Players League, and then from the Players League, he did finally go to the National League. Talk about that moving from the American Association to the Players League and finally to the National League.
So he had opportunities early on when he first started playing to play in the National League. I think we should all understand that the National League had been around, but it wasn't like the National League had been around for 25 years at that point. So I don't think that there was as much like, oh, I have to go play in that league. And he was really content to stay at home. As we've kind of alluded to a bunch, he kind of was, a shy, insecure person. He was very happy to be at home in this safe environment. So while there was always rumors and talk about him going to the National League while he was in Louisville, I think deep down inside he was happy to never go. The 1889 season is an utter disaster. They lose 100 games. They hold still the longest losing streak in Major League Baseball. And Pete feels disrespected, not just because the season was bad, but more importantly, he felt that the team didn't pay him what he was owed, and he was fined a bunch for things that he felt were incorrect. So he wants to get out of there after that season. The Players League happens to be starting, and it's kind of, as we said earlier, all the players kind of taking ownership. So it's the best players from the National League, best players from the American Association, forming the World League. So it was arguably the best league that year. It had all the best players, all the best talent. The owner of Cleveland was a friend of Pete, so he has that familiar connection, and he makes the move to go there because, again, he has kind of a friendly face, somebody he knows there. The Players League folds after 1 year, and Pete then makes the jump into the National League. He still will kind of come back to Louisville and move around, but he goes Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and Louisville and kind of bounces around. And even that season, the 1891 season, like we said, he, finished, almost wins the batting title that year. He finishes third and he broke his wrist. Kid Gleason broke his wrist towards the end of the season, and he was on a tear. So it's not inconceivable that another strong month, he wins a batting title in the National League that year. So I don't think that the National League, we look at it differently now, but I don't think for Pete it was necessarily like, oh, I have to get to the National League. He had opportunities. I think he was very happy to stay where he was. And it was less about going to the National League than going to cities where he maybe had a connection, where it was closer. Cincinnati was close to Louisville. He was content to go there. Pittsburgh itself isn't that far either. So I think he was content to go to places that weren't that far away from him.
There are people who are doctors. There are people who are bartenders, people who, merchants, all sorts of different job titles. What is a baseballist? And
it is what Pete's job was listed in the census in Louisville. So I guess it's fair to say that he was a professional baseball player. Is the best you can say with that. I mean, he was. Pete, like, baseball is Pete's identity. He really seems lost without it. He talked about baseball all the time. He tried a number of things in between in the off season, as other players would do to make money. He opened a store. He, ran a bar. He was a cigar salesman, but nothing really stuck. And it seemed he just always wanted to be around baseball. But it was hard because some of those outlets that we have now are announcing and coaching on all these different levels, and all these different things really weren't there. So I think it became a bit of a struggle when he wasn't a baseballist anymore to kind of survive and whatever. So
When you were researching and writing the book, how difficult was it, or how difficult was it to try and separate fact from fiction?
That to me was the main goal of it. Once I really started researching him, and there's all these stories we talked about, and trying to understand which of those stories is true. And you can quickly figure that out when you see it alluded to and how it's written about. And, I was lucky enough, there were some letters that I saw, not from Pete, but other players who may have mentioned some stuff. So trying to see where the stories are. And then sometimes you could literally find another story that explained that situation. But often those stories were buried. And because they're not as interesting, that's the one that's forgotten about. So sometimes you could find a direct, rebuke to that. And then other times it was kind of making those connections of his health issues and why he would do it. And he would speak about some of these things and, I'm having these problems here. And so we can make an understanding of I acted this way or he acted this way. I think the two kind of best stories that illustrate this, one of the biggest thing Pete's known for besides baseball is his drinking. So one of the famous stories is after a game, it had been raining and the gutter in front of the hotel was filled with water. And so Pete goes out and he gets a cigar and he gets his fishing gear and he sits out front and he's gonna sit there and cast his line and try and catch dinner. And it's funny, right? You're laughing. It's a funny story. We can all picture this being a funny story. But it's not really what happened. What happened is he was going to go fishing and he got drunk and he passed out on the sidewalk and they had to carry him back into the hotel. So that becomes not as funny. But we'd rather tell the story about him doing that. And I think there's a lot of those stories like that. The other one is the famous quote that's attributed to him is, I can't hit till I hit the bottle, right? And it sounds like this, I'm going to take a drink, I'm going to walk up there, and I'm going to crush the ball. But that's not exactly what he said, and it's not the situation he said it in. In 1888, he had signed a temperance pledge like the rest of his team had because they were a hard-drinking team. And he was in the midst of a slump. He wasn't hitting well. And he told someone, I think I'm going to have to hit the bottle so I can hit. And though it seems slightly different to change, he was equating his ability to hit the ball to being drunk. And that to me is like a sad side of this. This guy who we talked about how talented he was, he thinks I'm not drinking. And the only thing I can understand why I'm not hitting is I'm not drinking. So I think I have to drink to hit. And that to me is the change there. It's not just this funny, I have to hit. So, before I go hit. So that to me was finding those stories there to really help kind of explain what the myth was and understanding who Pete was.
How important are the myths and his personal demons in shaping his legacy within the baseball community?
I mean, I think it's super important, right? I mean, all players are like that. I mean, no matter what era, there's those legends and there's those stories. And I think for Pete, he becomes a bigger than life figure. If we were just talking about this guy who had his numbers, it's impressive. But he's kind of forgotten as it is, and he has all this other quirky, crazy stuff. If all he was the guy that had, 3 titles and 2 leagues, and, we probably would forget about him. But he is a lot more interesting character when we can look about it. But then I also think it allows us to get a better understanding of other players, right? If we use a player like Pete, we can then kind of use him to illustrate other players of other eras and try and understand why they did what they did or why they may have acted the way they did. Like, it's easy to get lost in the myth and how they act and what they do, but sometimes maybe we can use him and go, well, that's not entirely who Pete was. Let's see about these other players. Is that who they were? What might be the story there? And I think that is what's important. But I think the myth of him is important, right? I mean, this loud, drunk guy who crushed the ball. I mean, it's a pretty good story.
Yeah, there was another loud, drunk guy supposedly who could crush a ball, came along about 30 years later from Baltimore.
Yeah.
By the name of Babe Ruth. Pete died at a young age. He was only 44. After his playing days were over, he really struggled with his health, his mental well-being. Talk about that, because he was in a mental institution, then out. Maybe he went back, maybe he didn't. It just seems like after his baseball days were done, it was sad.
Yeah, he's a bit of a tragic figure. The one side that isn't as tragic is it seems he actually, despite doing nothing but complaining about money his whole career, his family was relatively wealthy. He lived with his mom and his sister his whole life. But he seems to have done a good job of kind of keeping his money and keeping his wealth and not like blowing it. So that never seemed to be an issue, but he struggled to find a place and something to do. He wanted to become an umpire, and he actually was recognized for being extremely honest on the field and probably could have been a good umpire. But I think that the perception, like we said before, of who Pete was, you don't want that guy out there. So he couldn't get involved in baseball, so he struggled with that. He tried other jobs. He ran for city council, and he was a cigar salesman, like we were saying, and stuff like that. But nothing really stuck. He also kind of sees a decline in his health. His mastoiditis kind of really starts causing him lots of problems. He was institutionalized. I think it was less to do with a severe kind of breakdown and more a misunderstanding of some of those health conditions at the time. There was a lack of understanding about alcoholism, which he clearly was, and I think he was extremely depressed and, probably was in severe pain. And because he was acting that way, it was easier to institutionalize him and send him to a mental institute there. So the last, especially couple months of his life are pretty bad. He has a surgery. While they're doing the surgery, they discover some other tumors. So it seems he had some levels of some kind of cancer going on. He most likely had cirrhosis, from years of drinking like that. And so he eventually does die. He dies in 1940. He dies at the age of 44 in 1905. What exactly causes that? I think the best example that somebody once put in a paper was old age and liquor. And I think that's it. And even though he wasn't old, he lived a hard life. And I think it is interesting. We have a perception of Pete as being old because he started so young. One of his nicknames was Old Pete Browning or the Old War Horse or things like that. But he was 18 when he started. So he was never really the oldest guy in his team. He was always pretty young. But the perception is that he was always older because he started as a teenager, even before that, playing against grown men and, as a 16-year-old playing on that semi-pro team. So even, when he dies, there's the perception that he's a little older than he was possibly.
For his career, he hit 341. There are players throughout history who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, and there's players in the Hall of Fame, and you got to scratch your head and go, why is he in, and how come he's not in? Pete Browning's not in the Hall of Fame. What did you discover in your research as the reasons why he has not been elected to the Hall of Fame? What held him back? When I look at it, it's the demons. And I also look at it and go, well, he didn't play. While he played for a number of years, he played 13, 14, 15 years, somewhere in that range. He didn't play a lot of games every year. So I wonder if they think, well, his numbers were inflated because he only played 80 games. He didn't play 130 games all the time. What are the reasons that you think he's not in the Hall of Fame?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about the games to look at is he did miss games. But in some of those seasons, the one year they played 115 games, he played 112. Some of those games when he only played 75 games, they only played 80 games. So he was sometimes pretty close to playing all those games, or he wasn't missing too many. To me, the biggest reason is he played in the American Association. And by the time the Hall of Fame comes about, in the 1930s, the American Association had been forgotten about. The National League was the dominant league. And baseball scholarship, as we know it today, didn't exist, right? We didn't look at all these numbers. So a lot of those statistics from the American Association had been forgotten about, and it took a long time for people to go back and reevaluate that. And even then, you figure when they're doing those first couple of classes, they are still already pretty far removed from some of those players in the 19th century. So as far as people who saw them play, they're starting to really be limited. And again, we can go back now and I can go watch, a YouTube game of somebody from the 50s or 60s play and get a grasp of what they were. But they didn't have that. So I think because, one, there was no understanding of the American Association, it took a long time for people to come around and really understand that. I think that has really played against him. And then I think, two, we're so far removed now, it's hard to go back. And he's not the only player from the 19th century that the argument can be made should be in the Hall of Fame. But we're so far removed, and all these players now, right, when they vote on the Hall of Fame, they're lumped in 1980 and before. I mean, that seems kind of unfair. because we have no connection to these 19th century players. We're not going to see them. We can't do it. And, to me, and this is way above my pay grade, I think they need to take like one more sweep through the Hall of Fame or the 19th century and see who needs to be in. As far as does he deserve to be in, somebody said this to me, and I think this is how I like to evaluate Hall of Fame players. And again, this is above my pay grade. Nobody's asking me to vote on him or whatever. But what did people's eyes tell them at the time about that player? And he was regarded as one of the best players at the time. Sports writers and players talked about him as one of the best players at the time. Why do we discount what they said then? Because now we can look at numbers and we can use 47 different, formulas to figure out that we don't think that this number equates and is equal to this. They thought he was the best player at the time or one of the best players. Why are we going to discount those who saw them play? And we do that with lots of players from lots of other eras. We want to look back and go, those home run numbers they don't match up to this, or his warts. Was he regarded as one of the best players? When you look at him, I think we should trust our eyes a little bit more, especially with 19th century players, because it's hard to compare those numbers to now when we're talking about a game that was just utterly different.
Yeah, his numbers, OPS 940, 842, 829, 923, 830, 1.011, batting average 378, 338, 336, 362, 340, 402, 313, and in 1889, 256. But then he came back and won the title the next year, hitting 373. The guy was a hitting machine. So it does make you wonder. They have all these different committees. Sometimes you wish they had a committee that could, like you say, go back to the 19th century and maybe have a special wing for just some, special 19th century players that should be in the hall. Tim, what's the Casey Award?
So it's given annually to the best baseball book of the year. I was a finalist for it. I did not win it. I was a finalist for it. I was in some pretty amazing company, but I was a finalist for it. So it was an amazing honor just to be among some of those books there. When I started this at the Slugger Museum with my wife, I did not think that's where it would end up at. And to be recognized as part of that group, it's books that, when I go back through the years and look at, you're like, oh, wow, that. And then, the Lou Gehrig book and, the Pete Rose. And there's so many great books there that it's to be in that company and to feel Pete can be in that company is pretty humbling.
Yeah, it's awesome. I can't imagine that when you finally started to write it, I'm going to write with the goal of the Casey Award in mind. You wrote it because you wanted to write a book about it. What a great honor. And wow, I thank you so much for spending so much time with me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. This was really fun.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun, like I said, to talk baseball and introduce people to Pete. He is a interesting character, and I think when people really get into him, one, he's interesting, and then two, they realize how interesting 19th century baseball was, and maybe more people will go back and kind of check out an era and look into some stuff maybe they wouldn't have done before.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being on Sports Forgotten Heroes, Tim.
Thanks for having me. It was a real treat. It was a great way to spend the evening.
Anytime.
Pete Browning played 10 years for Louisville in the American Association, 1 year in the Players League with Cleveland, and split his final 3 years on 5 different teams in the National League. The one area of his game we did not discuss was his speed. In fact, he stole 258 bases over the course of his career with a high of 103 stolen bases in 1887 with Louisville. Of course, the game was different back then, but he certainly knew how to play. Thanks again to my guest, Tim Newby, and thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.